Hey, how's it going? Hope you're doing well and learning tons, making your way through these videos. So for this one, we're going to be going over how to tell if a candidate is a fit for a given position. Now, a few things before we begin. One, this is going to be a bit of a longer video, so my apologies in advance. But also, two, and maybe more importantly, is that this isn't something that is going to be perfectly generalizable, right? The exact profile you're chasing is going to depend a lot on the position as well as client desires, but that said, there are some general models, so to speak, that we can study to learn more about the patterns you'll begin to notice as you recruit. So again, this isn't something that is, gonna carry you through recruiting for, every single position you're on and all the different functions, but just something where I thought it could be useful to spend a little bit of time going over what sort of the tendencies we notice and look for are, right? And also just take a little bit of a stab at using a basket of information to then identify what kind of candidates are going to be the best fits. Now, lastly, real quick before we begin, just a reminder to take whatever notes you feel are helpful and be sure to write down any questions you have for discussion later. Now, that all being said, without further ado, let's dig in. All right, so before we begin, would be good to first clarify what we're looking for and set our parameters. So this is sort of the first step in the exercise. For this video, we'll be taking a look at the Area Operations Manager position with Great Expressions Dental Centers, also called Area Manager Dental Office Operations. It's the same thing. But I chose this one because it's a little bit more straightforward than, say, the clinical partner position we've previously looked at, and it has some more generalizable takeaways as far as who's a fit and how to discern that information. So to start off by filling you in on the key points, an AOM, as they're typically called, Area Operations Manager, AOM, is essentially responsible for the operational management of a region of dental clinics. In terms of the operations reporting structure, each clinic typically has an office or operations manager. The title can vary, but essentially one leader for that office who then reports to a regional manager or director. Now, in GDC structure, that person is the AOM, that regional leader. And then they themselves report to a vice president of operations overseeing a larger market, such as, a state, or if it's a state like Florida where they have a lot of business in, maybe it's separated into there's a few VPOs. But that's sort of the scaling of how it goes for position to position and, the reporting structure. Now, it's important to quickly note that the titles as well as org structure are going to vary a lot depending on the company. We'll be looking at instances involving these misalignments, but it's largely part of the game here to be trying to discern what that person's relative responsibility is for their organization. And it's something that also is just in part learned in time, that ability to gauge, right? But with that understanding in mind, let's run through some backgrounds that align with the position and client desires. This is the information that is largely going to be coming from the intake call for your own reference. So, to relay those facts to you in this search, the single most important qualification was similar experience managing operations of multiple offices in a dental or healthcare setting. Now, dental was definitely the preference, but a similarly styled healthcare operations such as ambulatory clinics, physical therapy offices, or even veterinary hospitals could give the candidate the right mix of managing similar operations while still dealing with doctors and some of those harder to navigate personalities you're going to find in sort of a clinical system. So dental is the ideal, but there is some flexibility there. More importantly is really that multi-unit or regional operations experience, with the preference from GDC being management of at least 4 offices to be ready for a jump to the range of 10 to 20 offices that they would be overseeing in this position. So that said, the best fit is going to be somebody who as closely matches the role with their experience as possible. So while it may be easier to find candidates who meet the threshold for a step up, maybe seem like a natural, candidate for a promotion, our ideal candidates are going to be those who are already there or almost there, essentially, with some room for a compensation bump or some other compelling factor why they would make a move. Right. Ultimately, that's why they're bringing us in as a search firm, is they want people who are basically already doing this and they're not worried about their ability to succeed stepping in. In fact, even the people we bring in should not only be handling pretty comparable work, but especially if they're not, they should demonstrate a lot of indications that they're going to grow with the organization long term, that they really are that sort of dynamic individual. Now, backtracking a little, these are the basic parameters, but you'll likely have a lot more variables to consider when conducting the search. But again, for the sake of this exercise, it'll get us where we need to be. Really just want to take a few stabs at sort of that discerning process, figuring out who is and is not a fit and why. So we're going to be looking at some of those, typical reasons in both directions in this video. All right. So, real quickly before we dig into specifics, just want to clarify that what you're looking at here is LinkedIn Recruiter. So, again, something that you'll get a more sort of a technical walkthrough elsewhere. But this is essentially the recruiting end of LinkedIn, something we subscribe to and pay for, and is basically just a navigator for going through LinkedIn profiles. So, we'll be looking at these instead of resumes, just for the sake of being more similar to what you would be looking at while sourcing. But with that said, for this first example, we're going to start by looking at somebody who is the perfect fit, somebody who is just an ideal match for the role. So in this instance, that person is Nasim Kazmika, a candidate who was actually hired for this Great Expressions role. So you'll see it down there. He actually has it labeled operations manager, which is a bit, not actually his title, but hey, we won't hold that against Nasim. So you'll see that position now, but let's take us back and imagine his current role is still this one with North American Dental Group, NADG. So most importantly, he's in a similar role now in this as a regional manager to what he would be doing with GDC, and he's been in it for over a year. He's also been promoted several times in pretty quick succession, indicating that he's one of their more up and comers or fast movers, so to speak, right? He is somebody who is just consistently coming in and sort of making an impression and quickly working his way up the food chain, so to speak. So that track, his track also advances through a hygiene background. You can see that here as a dental hygienist. Something that's a plus for him in this context because it gives him additional knowledge on dental office operations on the clinical side rather than just the back office administrative side. So in a DSO model like Great Expressions, where it's effectively run by the twin pillars of operations leaders and clinical leaders, having an understanding of the other side is really going to serve you well. Lastly, he actually includes his specific office count in his description of the role as well, right? You'll see overseeing 13 locations totaling over 14 million in net revenue annually. So in this instance, that really helps solidify his fit as he would be stepping up to the high teens with GDC. So, jumping from 13 to maybe, 15 to 18 offices, not a huge jump. So this overall gave me the indication that he may also have room for a compensation bump with a move, since it's a little bit lower than his current responsibility, which would make it a good option for him rather than us getting into the process of trying to sell him on a lateral move. While it's not always the case and shouldn't constitute a be-all, end-all rule of thumb, that responsibility directly translates to compensation, it did work out in this case. So he ended up interviewing super well when I spoke with him. He was clearly super intelligent, somebody with a bright future in dental. And, that carried him to end up being offered on the high end of the AOM range and ultimately get a good pay bump with it. So that's somebody who, again, just in quick, really hits on doing similar work now, having a great background and sort of some extra advantages, having been on the clinical side, good career progression, indicating that he is sort of that up and comer too. And then, when it came time to meet with him, he was a great interview, really sharp in conversation. And, interviewing is something we'll talk about in a later video, but that's basically what it's going to look like when somebody is just checking every box and you're like, this is somebody I need to reach out to. But we've got some more examples like this, so see you in just a sec. Okay, great. So this next profile is Beverly, or Bev as she went by, Lingerfeld. She was another candidate who interviewed with GDC, but she actually was not hired in the end. We can circle back to those shortcomings at the end, but let's just get started on the positive and things that made me think, looking through her profile, why she was definitely a fit and somebody to reach out to. So for the immediate read of her profile, it's also important to note that she has since changed her employer to undisclosed. You'll see here, district manager at undisclosed. But it is, and it previously read Benevis, another major DSO that we've actually since started doing some work with. But she likely has them unlisted just because their reputation took a bit of a hit before their leadership changeover that we're actually helping them through, sort of the back end of now. But, again, just something that I think that because they didn't have the greatest reputation, doesn't say Benevis now, but it did at the time. So, just as far as, the decision making goes and the thought process, wanted to clarify that. That said, let's look at her experience. So the first thing to become clear should be the fact that she has significant experience as a regional manager, right? This should indicate, you see the 8 years there. So that should indicate the qualification as well as the possibility that she'd be open to moving because she hasn't been promoted or had growth opportunities in a long while. So 8 years in one position, it's interesting because we talked about with Nassim that, the quick track indicated that he was, a really bright star with the organization. So this could also indicate that maybe she isn't that bright star. That said, that alone shouldn't stop us from reaching out. We can get a better sense of that in an interview, and the general feel is promising. Not everyone you interview is going to get the job in the end. It's just the nature of how things work. That you need to have those conversations and do your own due diligence before presenting in order to find the best possible candidates. But even still, we can look at this and we can think, okay, there's a chance that she's one of those best candidates because she's very experienced in this role. And who knows, maybe she's a little bit fed up with things there. Wants a new opportunity at a new organization, could be worth reaching out to. So beyond this most recent role, she also has previous dental office manager experience and also some retail experience, which isn't so different from dental, so as to offer no value. Of course, something in healthcare would probably be better, but that is just sort of, a background before getting into dental. That works. She also has her master's in management. You can see here from Indiana Wesleyan, which is of course a definite plus to have that kind of educational polish. But now to sort of circle back, as mentioned, Bev was ultimately not extended an offer in the end. So to give some reasoning, she was ultimately perceived as lacking energy and enthusiasm in her internal interviews. Now that's something again that we'll talk about in greater detail in a later video. But it's a good example of a strong background only being as strong as the candidate ultimately is in an interview, right? You can find somebody who has all of the experience the client asks for, but if they meet with them and they just don't find them to be very dynamic, it's going to be tough to get them over that hump 9 times out of 10. So that was sort of the hurdle here. And, I think probably in part why she, hadn't been advancing with Benevis despite spending 8 years there. But we'll be looking at some other fits going on, Bev just being at least on the surface level, somebody you should look at and think, okay, this person is worth reaching out to because there's a good chance that they're a decent fit. But we'll start looking at some, less straightforward examples starting in the next one. Okay, so for our next example, we'll be looking at a different kind of fit, and that's the outside fit. This is somebody who isn't a perfect match on the surface level, but ultimately aligns well with the client's main interests. So in the context here, we'll be looking at somebody from a healthcare background, Nicole Dunn. Now, you may remember me saying at the start that that was a possibility, really the preference being dental. But there's some generalizable lessons about how to look at candidates that are working across industries, would be stepping into a new industry, but ultimately doing a lot of the same functions and likely positioned for success. So the first thing that you'll notice is her title of senior practice manager. So you'll remember that a practice manager typically indicates a single location, but we have a couple clues that that's not the case here. First, the senior leads me to believe that she's managing more than just the typical office. So, a good example of sort of looking for those clues, because the title isn't going to tell us everything. Second, she also includes detail in her LinkedIn, which is awesome, super helpful. Again, showing the importance of looking a little further when we're unclear, right? It's one thing to just sort of scroll through 30 profiles and just look at all of their titles. But, this is the type of thing where unless you click in and take a slightly closer look, you're not going to see that she's managing multiple service lines and thus managing probably multiple locations. So again, in this case, this is something that we would want to check in an interview, of course, make sure that these are, multi-location management. But there's a good shot that these are across multiple facilities, given that South Coast is a really large organization and there's no single hospital or single address given in her LinkedIn. Thus, since she's managing multiple clinics operations, dealing with doctors, has her MBA, and a few leadership positions under her volunteer work, we can make an educated guess that her lack of dental experience specifically can be overcome by her overall strength and general readiness to make a not huge transition. So, when I ended up meeting with her, there were elements of those. She definitely was very dynamic. She did advance to the final round, actually, but she was ultimately not hired. Really, what had ended up happening was that she lost out to another candidate who did have that dental background and honestly would have been overqualified for the position had it not been for some extenuating circumstances that had that other candidate looking for a change. That said, her making it to the final round shows how you can find strong candidates based on the overall profile, even when they're not a perfect background match. So again, this not being somebody from dental, you might think, well, then how are they going to manage dental offices? It's a lot of the same operations, right? It's very generalizable, and there's similarities in the industry as well as the types of people you're dealing with. That said, that's what we're going to be looking for, is still having that alignment and function, even if they are outside the industry, alignment in terms of the nature of the work, the organizational model. And this is something that we'll explore further in the next set of examples. Great. So next, what we're going to be taking a look at are candidates who might seem like fits at a glance, but actually lack experience in the type of role we're recruiting for. So these are going to be people who, ultimately kind of fall under a different function and thus aren't a fit for what we're specifically recruiting here, AOMs. So the first of these is Marcus Smith. At first glance, it could be taken that he's a director in a medical system, giving him a promising profile. Upon closer inspection, though, you'll notice that he's specifically a director of projects. So this means that he falls more in a project management or operational improvement basket rather than pure operations, with the difference being that he's less focused on day-to-day running things and more seeking to analyze specific issues or initiatives and design those to be more effective. And if you go back through his experience, you'll see this reiterated. Ultimately, despite some overlap, the lack of operations experience makes him not a fit for this role. So this is kind of a classic example of, easier to reach out to him if you're just sort of scrolling through just titles. You see that he is a director with Morehouse, or maybe it's even looking through here. I mean, this is partially just also an example of how, you begin to build that familiarity with what you're looking for, right? Just as you go through a job, and you'll begin to notice sort of some of those differences. It's a skill set that you build up over time. But got some more examples to look at, so we'll be transitioning to those. So this next profile offers a different look because it's actually pretty bare. And you're going to run into this. So something that's useful to talk about, right? Not everyone has a perfectly updated or even effectively descriptive LinkedIn. And while that polish is nice for us, we're not hiring a social media manager. So it's on us to use the information available to determine whether they're a fit. So in this case, Gilbert, it looks like he could be a fit at first, right? He's a regional manager with DECA, which would be a similar background to Nassim or Bev, sorry, doing pretty similar work. However, the RDA isn't there for no reason, right? Granted, it probably doesn't make sense right away, but it's on us to conduct that due diligence and, make sure, hey, is this RDA just sort of organizational lingo, or is there something that this typically is? So a quick Google search along the lines of what is an RDA dental will turn up that it means registered dental assistant. So in case you're not familiar, a dental assistant actually helps dentists by doing a lot of the smaller time-consuming tasks on the clinical side so that the dentist can maximize his or her time on the most important, difficult, or skillful tasks. So Gilbert is actually in a role more similar to Nassim's middle one with NADG, as he's managing dental assistants across a region rather than office operations across a region. And as such, he's not a fit for this role. So it's just a good example of paying attention to the little details and differentiations in titles, especially when there's not a ton of information available, really zeroing in and seeing what we can find, and ultimately making sure that the person is actually doing what we want them to. And, again, you can't spend 20 minutes on each person, but the skill here is sort of noticing those little deviations that say, I think that means that maybe he's not doing exactly what we want here. And in this case, that was the RDA, which lets us know that he's in dental assistant leadership. But we'll see another sort of example in the next one. So for this last example of those sort of surface level fits that are actually misaligned, we're looking at Kelly Queen's profile, someone with a medical rather than a dental background. So we can see that she was previously a director of operations and is now a regional director. Seems promising, right? Maybe a little overqualified, but they fall enough in the basket that they could be worth just sending a message to and seeing if they have one of those reasons why they'd be looking at making a move that might otherwise be lateral. But if you look a little bit more closely at her headline, actually, however, you'll see that her actual title is focused on clinical mission integration rather than operations. IHS also stands for Informatic Health Systems and is more of its own subdivision. So she's actually not a fit, despite what seem like, really kind of misleading titles down here. But it's a good example of how those titles and the headlines aren't always consistent, and just paying the extra attention, checking those different boxes, looking at both, can help us save time on wasted outreach or, wasted interviews. So in the next examples, we'll be looking at instead people who are just more straightforwardly underqualified. But let me know if you have any questions about, best practices in terms of looking for these, theoretical fits that actually in the details aren't. But I will see in just a sec for some underqualified examples. So as mentioned, for these next three examples, I want to take a look at people who are just simply underqualified. It should be a bit more straightforward, but it's also good examples of how paying extra attention can help us come to that conclusion and, ultimately save us time rather than finding out these things in an interview. So for this first profile, we're going to look at Anasa Holden. On the surface level, you can see here, she seems like a great candidate ready for a step up. She's been in office or a practice manager for several years now. She's got a bunch of educational polish as well. You can see here the Doctor of Business Administration, actually. And she is also currently managing two practices, so it is technically multi-unit. And those all things, when I saw her profile, were sort of tempting and thinking, hey, we're ideally going to find that lateral move, but maybe this is, one of those stars who's really ready for a step up and going to wow them in an interview. That said, better judgment prevails and should tell us that ultimately she isn't going to be a fit regardless, because two locations just simply does not make the grade. As mentioned at the start, GEDC wanted at least 4 to 5 locations to prove you have some experience juggling multiple facilities. It's just sort of inherently different than, one home base or even 2 home bases where you're there most of the time, as compared to when you're almost never there and really managing remote. The gap, but so ultimately, the gap between 2 and 12 to 20 locations, it's just too big a difference. So while this may seem like a prime step up candidate, she is underqualified, and it just goes to show that our job as a search firm is to find the talent that's above what you would expect or look for when promoting from within. And while up and comers are great, they have to have several things going for them to be competitive, including some experience in a similar role. And the last piece is also that it just goes to show this is why it's really important to pay close attention to the intake call. We might think, hey, this seems like exactly the type of person who's ready to become a regional manager. She's done great, has all this polish as a single location manager. But ultimately, it was told to us point blank and simple, managing just a couple locations, anything less than 4 to 5, that's just too different and it's not going to work. And at that point, it's a non-starter. So that's how we know, hey, this one's not going to be a fit. Let's move on and save our time. So next up is Eugenia, someone from a medical background, but seems to align well with that regional director niche. You can see here, regional office manager float. However, looking closely at that, she's a regional float, which again, look it up if you need to. Those extra titles likely aren't in there for no reason. And if you can find something on Google, then it's probably a generalizable thing. But we know that to be a float means that she's floating from office to office based on need, and acting as a then essentially a single location manager while she's there. Thus, she is not in that regional manager role, and as a result, not qualified. It's a quick example, but it's a good one again on just paying attention to any deviations from that standard title. It can be really tempting when working through a long list of potential matches and not going through individual profiles to breeze through more quickly and just add people who have those key buzzwords. But this is just a classic example of why you got to be careful, or else you're going to miss these kinds of details and possibly spend 30 minutes in an interview with this person that you could otherwise be spending achieving some objective. So the last one of this batch is David Gustave, a regional manager with MB2, a dental organization. So, surface level seems like it should be a match. No, unfortunately, this is an example of when we want to look at the dates. He's only actually been a regional manager for a few months, and pretty straightforwardly that makes him underqualified due to lacking significant experience. He even has a similar track record prior to a candidate like Nassim. Quick advancement, clinical experience, but he lacks tenure in the regional role. And since that's the number one most important qualifier for the client, having that multi-unit management experience, he misses the mark. So tempting, but a good example of tenure being important, as well as how some experience is going to take priority. He has all of that great supplemental experience, but ultimately he just hasn't spent enough time in the main sort of objective here, being a regional manager. And as such, his candidacy with GDC would be a non-starter for this position, despite all those outside temptations. So again, just goes to show, you can have all that great, supplemental experience, all the little details you'd want to check, but if you don't meet the fundamentals, then you're probably not making the mark. So this next example should be pretty straightforward. Now, after looking at some underqualified examples, we're going to look at just a case of someone being overqualified for context and to have an opposite example. Now, just real quickly, of course, we talk about wanting to get the most qualified person as possible, but the issue with reaching out to people who are overqualified is that ultimately they're very unlikely to accept your email, schedule an interview, and likely take the position. And as such, not really a great use of resources to reach out to a bunch of people who would be taking a step down for this role. And also, if especially if we're working at the executive level, where we may want to network with some of these executives later on, for business development opportunities in healthcare or one of our main fields, if we're reaching out to them for roles that are way below their current one, it's going to make us seem like we don't know what we're doing exactly. So figured it would be good to touch base on what an overqualified candidate looks like. So, of course, if they have a title here, I mean, we're searching for a regional manager, director level role. If, it's a VP or a C-level officer, obviously they're overqualified. But to make it a little bit less straightforward, here we have Rebecca Bardo, a regional executive director of clinical operations. So looking through her profile, there's a few details that should clue us in that she likely wouldn't be interested. First, executive director is actually a much more senior rank than just director. It can range from a senior director to a C-level position for a certain group or function. For example, in a nonprofit, typically your chief executive officer is referred to as an executive director. Second, to confirm that, we can see that she actually previously was in a regional manager role several years ago. So even though we don't know all of the details of her current work, you're rarely going to find somebody who jumps to do what they were doing 5 to 10 years ago. Typically, what they want to be doing is advancing instead. So again, if you see somebody, did the role you're recruiting for 5, 10 years ago, did other work since then, they probably don't want to feel themselves backtracking into what they were already doing when they were younger. Now, this is an example that takes a little digging, but oftentimes it should be straightforward. If you're unclear on titles generally and how sort of, general organizational structure works, reach out and we can go over some typical structures and, talk about this in a little bit more depth. So for these next couple of examples, we're going to be looking at the importance of organizational size in the context of evaluating someone's fit or qualifications. Point blank and simply, organizational size matters, and it can make somebody who seems underqualified actually be perfect, or it can make somebody who seems like a fit actually be over or underqualified. So while it's important to first understand what an organization does, it's equally important to understand the size of the org and the relative responsibility of that individual in the context of that information. So the first example we're going to be looking at here is Walker Flynn, and he is somebody who is less qualified than the title indicates. You'll see here that he is a director of operations for a dental group. Now, a few things to notice in terms of the org is that he's working for. First, it's not a majorly recognizable DSO, so it's worth looking them up and looking the org or at least checking out their LinkedIn, right? Just sort of due diligence on our part, making sure we understand what this company is. Online, what you can find is that they only have about 3 locations. So while he's likely managing all of them as director of operations, that's under the mark of 4 to 5 that we're looking for. He probably has some additional responsibility by working at a smaller org, some extra hats he has to wear because they don't have entire departments, to cover individual functions. But at the end of the day, that limited scope of locations is tough to overcome. He has some nice educational polish as well, which makes him a bit more attractive. But this is an example of aligning our priorities with client wishes. While you or I may think that he's ready for the role, we ultimately did present this individual on the basis that, hey, he's only managing about 4 practices, but he's managing all of the 4 practices and doing a ton for them. Ultimately, the client just sort of repeated, hey, that is not enough locations and just sort of fundamentally different from what they would be doing here. So again, just sort of goes to show, one, the importance of doing some research, because this is somebody who we might even think is overqualified if we don't check it up. But also two, just continuing to, follow through with what the client is looking for beyond even just your or I's best judgment. This next profile, Nancy Nycombe, is a very similar one to the previous one of Walker's. So looking through, she was also a director of operations for a small DSO, Angle Implant Dentistry. So you can see online as well as in her position description that it is 3 locations in all. So once more, again, this is sort of an exercise in aligning with client expectations. If they told us that they wanted someone primed to jump into the major DSO world, she would be great as a diamond in the rough type of candidate. But because they want that big box volume of locations, somebody with experience being in as part of a more major organization, be more similar to what they would be doing here, she's ultimately just not in line with exactly what they're asking for. So again, another director of operations, theoretically a little higher qualified, who's actually a little bit lower qualified than we would want for this role. And that was sort of the rationale in Nancy ultimately not getting this position. But we'll be looking at a different sort of scenario in the next example. So after having looked at those two, this example is something of the opposite scenario. Now, Darius, who we're looking at here, is a regional director for Pacific Dental Services, a major DSO. Now, here's really where the key is that GEDC has one regional level before VP, right? Remember, this role, has the single office managers report to them and they report to a VP. But at Pacific Dental, they actually have 2. So if you look in his experience, you can see he was actually a regional manager before his current role as a regional director. So that's our cue that he's already been in an AOM type role and would thus be overqualified for this position and not worth reaching out to. So in contrast with the last 2 candidates, it demonstrates how with larger organizations, you can see more volume of responsibility at a given title level than with a smaller org, even if he's not dipping his toes in some of the additional work being done by a Nancy or Walker, who's a director of operations for their full enterprise. So again, just sort of an example, it's just an interesting example of how these are, this is somebody with a very similar title to both Walker and Nancy, but in in 2 of those cases, they were underqualified, and in one of these cases, they are overqualified. So really the main difference being the context of their organization and their corresponding scope of responsibility. Great. So our last example in this vein of thinking about organizational size is Ashley, a director of primary care operations. So presumably with that title, she is handling multiple primary care clinics for a large health system. And primary care is a pretty similar business model to dental, if you think about it, right? It's all about sort of those shorter block appointments, checking people in, getting that patient flow through there. It's a very full day. However, when we look closer, we can see that she was previously in a regional role already. So while this isn't dental and, it's not the exact same structure, you can still see that same trend we were looking at in the last profile, where they were previously in a role that sounds like it would be a really great match with the one we're looking for. So her current role as director of operations is likely a step or a half step above that of an AOM. Again, just in contrast to Walker and Nancy, titles are dependent on the size of the org and the number of levels they have. So where a small business might have 3 to 5 tiers between an office manager and a CEO, a large DSO or health system may have a dozen in comparison. So again, something where if you just looked at her title and saw director of operations, perfect, you'd send her the email. And you would probably not get a response. So, just a great example of, again, paying attention to that progression and, thinking about in the context of the organizational size, Beaumont Health being a huge group, it makes sense that they have, a couple extra tiers there. So the last thing I want to do is touch base on a theoretical candidate who I don't have an example of readily available. But that last category of things to look out for would be job hoppers. So to be a job hopper typically means you have a record of leaving positions very rapidly after joining. Clients will range from weary of to just outright against any candidates with these indications, as the last thing they want to do is waste time and money training them only to reap those benefits for a short bit before they leave and are out the door onto their next opportunity. We should just say that generally, and we so as such, we don't typically reach out to them, which is why I don't have a bunch of saved job hopper profiles. But to just sort of go over what that theoretically looks like is one quick position being there for a year or so isn't typically damning, as it likely has a reasonable explanation if it's isolated, and otherwise that person is at each organization for a reasonable amount of time. Now, if they have 2 to 3 brief stints, it's more concerning, but still possibly, explicable if they're not against the norm, right? Or if they're not the norm. I'm saying, apologies. In short, if it's just a few brief stints, otherwise steady employment, it could be worth asking about in an interview if they're otherwise promising. Hey, I know that the client is going to be wondering about these things. Can you tell me about some of the rationale behind these transitions? But if somebody has, more than 3 quick transitions, or the majority of their positions even have been held for under 2 years, they're probably just not worth reaching out to. The client is unlikely to bring them in, and we don't want to have to potentially redo the search when they leave in a few short months, right? I mean, we offer a guarantee, so them leaving quickly isn't only bad for client satisfaction, it's also just bad because we're going to have to do the work again for free. Really, again, if there's just one that's isolated, check on it, but it's probably fine. If there's a couple, but generally all right, otherwise okay. If they seem strong, it could be worth spending the time in an interview to ask more about it, and determine for yourself whether they're genuinely job hopping, or if there were reasonable circumstances. But again, if it's the main theme, or just like 3 consecutive positions that they haven't been at for more than 18 months, then probably a job hopper, probably not worth spending your time on. Okay, so that was a lot of example profiles to go through. So let's spend a minute and quickly review what we saw here, just to make sure that we're on the same page about what each of those entails. So we looked at Nassim and Bev as examples of an ideal fit who just checks every box and you definitely want to reach out to. We looked at Nicole Dunn as an example of an outside fit who's competitive while not still being as straightforward a match, demonstrating the importance of the holistic profile. We looked at Marcus, Gilbert, and Kelly as examples of people who fall under different functions to demonstrate the importance of attention to detail. We looked at Anasa, Eugenia, and David as examples of people who are underqualified in some straightforward, telltale ways. We looked at Rebecca as an example of somebody who's straightforwardly overqualified and likely wouldn't be interested. And lastly, we looked at Walker, Nancy, Ashley, Darius as examples of how org size matters and how titles can indicate various levels of responsibility depending on the scale. We also discussed what a job hopper will look like on paper and how this presents hurdles that may or may not be surmountable. That was discussed while looking at Ashley's profile if you're looking to skip back to it. Now, it's important to remember that, though, while this is a general overview, with a specific position in mind. The details are always going to vary depending on the search that you're executing. That said, the same rules apply in terms of finding that ideal fit. You want to find somebody whose background experience is going to align well, somebody who is at the right size organization, and you're going to have to pay attention to some of those details to make sure their function and scope of responsibility are comparable to what you're looking for. It's also crucial to remember that the background experience, however, is not the sole determining factor. The minor details and context around their experience is hugely significant in shaping their overall candidacy. These are things that might be less obvious themes or experiences acquired in their roles, or lessons that they've learned that shape their approach today. And these may well be more apparent in interviews, which we will be covering in the next video. But the ability to shine in an interview is almost as important as that background. Lastly, I would also like to point to the importance of candidate interest. You could have the best fit in the world, but if they don't have a clear reason to be making a move, clients will often become disenchanted. If you have somebody who seems great, maybe even overqualified, and you can't explain why they're interested, the client is going to say, well, I don't really get why they're interested. And I'm not necessarily bringing them in to, possibly waste my time there if I can't understand that. In short, they want it to easily make sense, or they're going to think that it's either too good to be true or that there's something left being unsaid, and you're not going to be able to win over the clients on those candidates. Besides, we also don't want to go through the whole process of internal interviews unless we think the candidate is going to accept at the end. If they're just feeling things out only to back away, we're losing time and money. So, again, if you have a candidate who, seems overqualified, that, is weirdly just like, oh, well, I'm interested in learning more. At a certain point, you got to find out, are you serious about it and why? Now, that'll cover everything that we wanted to in this video. Again, I appreciate you bearing with me. Definitely a longer one. I know that we covered a lot. So please, any questions, anything you want to talk about in further detail, whether that's a specific example or one of the baskets of themes that we were talking about here, I'm more than happy to do so, or look at a different example for a different position. Just let me know, reach out, and looking forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Take care.